This podcast is made possible in part by Todd Ulbrich and Craig Brierly. Thank you so much, guys. So we got 2 new patrons this time around. Both joined at the $3 a month plus alpha tier, which means they get access to Japanese Plus Alpha, a solo podcast that I do about the Japanese language. And by the way, the latest episode 13, just came out a little while ago. That one came out around the end of May. So if you're curious about that, and by the way, that one is related to, I guess you would say, Japanese teenage girl slang. Actually, 2 specific words that came up in a radio show that I was listening to. So if you're curious about that, then you got to join the $3 a month plus alpha tier over at japankyo.com/Patreon. So once again, thank you so much, Todd and Craig. Really, I mean it from the bottom of my heart. You guys are amazing and you help make this show possible. Thank you. Welcome to Japan Station, a production of japankyo.com. I'm your host, Tony Vega. Let's get right into it. So my guest today is the Japan and Korea correspondent for The Guardian and the author of a brand new book called The War on Wheels, Inside the Keirin and Japan Cycling Subculture. So Keirin is essentially competitive cycling on a track, right? There's men's and women's Keirin. They get on bicycles and they ride around on a track. The winners get a whole bunch of money. All right. So, I mean, that's a super simple explanation. And Justin is going to explain it far better than I can because there's a whole lot of interesting dynamics. Now, you may be thinking, oh, I don't care about sports. I don't care about Keirin. And to be perfectly honest with you, until I read the book, I didn't really care all that much about Keirin. But after reading this book, it's just a fascinating world. My eyes have been open to it. There is so much interesting stuff that is going on behind the scenes. And this is an aspect of Japanese society that's kind of hidden away, right? You don't really hear people, for the most part, talk about Keirin. You don't really see it on TV, but there's a whole bunch of really interesting stuff going on. And this is due in large part to the fact that Keirin is one of these sports in Japan that you can actually go to the track and bet on, right? You can gamble. So kind of like horse racing or boat racing. You can go put down your money on who you think is going to win and maybe make a whole bunch of money. So because of this, there's a whole lot of regulations and really strict rules about what cyclists can and can't do and how you go about becoming a Keirin cyclist. And we're going to be talking about all that stuff in the conversation with Justin. But again, the book is called The War on Wheels. In the US, I think it has the, and in the UK, it does not have the there. So it would be War on Wheels in the UK. I think in the UK, it will be out later this month in June, but in the US, it's already out. And if you want to pick it up and use the Amazon affiliate link to support the show, then use japankyo.com/Amazon. Do your Amazon shopping. Won't cost you anything extra. Link will be in the show notes, like always. But anyway, let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Justin McCurry.
The next stop is Japan Station. The doors on the right side will open.
I do want to start with something that you mention in the book, but is not directly related to Keirin. And you mentioned in 2008 you had a meeting with a member of the Yakuza after like the Yamaguchi Gumi was like kind of I think they broke into different factions, right? And so you had some meeting, I think, in a lobby. Like, how did that happen? What was that like?
Yeah. One of the highlights of my Yakuza reporting over the years, I guess. Uh-huh. The catalyst for that interview was, I think, the former head of the Yamaguchi Gumi, which, as you know, is Japan's biggest Yakuza gang, crime syndicate, had died. Mm-hmm. And his successor...
was that the one where he got shot? Like, I think he died... of old age. Okay. I'm thinking of a different incident then. Okay.
Yeah, he died of natural causes, and his replacement was a guy called Kenichi Shinoda, who had actually spent time in prison for murdering a rival with a Japanese katana sword. So
Wow.
he had a pretty colourful background. And he was about to become, for want of a better word, the new godfather. And there was a lot of speculation about what this would mean for the direction of the Yamaguchi-gumi, whether it would lead to turf wars in Tokyo, because apparently he wanted to. Yamaguchi-gumi is based in Kobe, but the new boss wanted to sort of expand his sphere of influence to include parts of Tokyo. So through a mutual acquaintance, I guess, I managed to fix up this interview with the Yakuza senior Yamaguchi-gumi member who's mentioned in the book. He will have to remain nameless for the purposes of this interview. But it was quite a laborious process. I mean, fixing up interviews with certain people in Japan can be, quite a long and drawn out task. But this was a pretty laborious process as well. I was introduced to him, fittingly enough, in the basement of a very expensive Italian restaurant in Tokyo, and along with the acquaintance who'd introduced us, and we had a chat. It wasn't a formal interview. I think we were just he was trying to work out whether I was serious or not. I obviously wanted to get to know a little bit more about him. But the first thing that struck me was that, he didn't really look like your archetypal Japanese gangster. I noticed that he had all of his digits and no missing pinkies. He told me he didn't have a single tattoo. He came across really more as more of a businessman than a gang member. So we had that meal. Everything went pretty well. He then invited me to lunch. We had lunch, and then finally he said, "Okay, you can interview me, but on the understanding that my name doesn't appear in the article, and I'll tell you a little bit about what's happening with the Yamaguchi-gumi." So it ended up with us meeting in the lobby of a hotel, not a posh hotel by any means, just talking over coffee for about half an hour, and that's how that interview came to fruition. But I've interviewed several Yakuza connected people over the years, but he was senior. He had the ear of the new boss. I haven't. I met him for that interview. I wrote the story, and I haven't seen or heard of him since. And sometimes I think, well, I'd quite like to keep it that way, really.
No, interesting. I mean, you typically, you think Yakuza like flashy suits and the dyed hair and the punch pama and all that kind of stuff. But I guess there's the more, kind of straight-laced business kind of side to it as well, huh? Yeah,
I guess he was the face of sort of, the white-collar crime portion of Yakuza activities rather than the chimpira, like you say, with the punch perm and the flashy suits. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so, of course, Keirin does have this kind of, a connection to anything gambling related, I guess, does ultimately have some connection. Everybody wants to get their hand in the money, I guess, right? And so that's how that story kind of comes up in the book. But let's focus more on the Keirin itself for a little bit. And I'm wondering, how did you take an interest in this? How did you first, what was your first experience going to one of these, like, I guess, stadiums or event halls? Well, I'm not sure what you would call them, but like these tracks. What was it like?
Yeah, I mean, I should begin by saying that I wasn't a Keirin expert when I started researching the book. I mean, I knew Keirin. I'd seen a few races. I'd got a basic understanding of the rules. I'm a keen cyclist, albeit not a particularly good one. So I had a sort of passing interest, I guess. So my first visit to a velodrome, Keirin track velodrome, I think those are probably the best way to describe the stadia. Was in late 2016, so we're talking about 5 years ago. That was the biggest Keirin race in the sports calendar. It was the Grand Prix final at Tachikawa, just sort of west of Tokyo. There's a big velodrome there, has been for many years. And I'd already decided I was going to write this book, so I went along to watch there were 11 races on the final day of the Grand Prix, with the 11th and final race being the one with the $1 million prize for the winner. And it was one of those experiences you occasionally have in Japan where you think you've seen everything, you think you've seen every sort of everything Japan has to offer. You've rubbed shoulders with every possible demographic in Japanese society, and then you go somewhere and you realize that actually you haven't seen and done everything at all. You've just discovered something new and intriguing, and that's how I felt when I walked through the gates of Tachikawa Velodrome. I noticed immediately that it was very male. There was a good degree of testosterone in the air. Most of the other spectators were almost without exception were men above a certain age. There were younger guys, groups of colleagues who'd gone to the velodrome to have a few drinks and to watch a bit of cycling. But there were a lot of older guys, people I guess who were either in the twilights of their careers or their jobs, and certainly a good deal of guys who looked like they'd already retired. People weren't particularly well dressed. There was a lot of drinking, which is not unusual to see in Japan, as you know, but a lot of smoking, and not necessarily in the smoking areas, and a lot of litter.
Really?
Yeah.
Not characteristic, right? That you never hear about litter in Japan. But...
Well, right, and you read about Japanese sports fans who go to World Cup soccer tournaments and clean up after themselves afterwards, and the media is always deeply fascinated by this. But I noticed as the evening went on that the number of discarded coffee cups and plastic beer glasses and betting slips just grew, as the evening went on, as I said. And by the end of it, there was a sort of a carpet of litter at Tachikawa Velodrome, and gangs of velodrome workers whose job it was to go around picking everything up before they could go home. So it was an unusual experience. It was loud. There was a lot of makijita, a lot of tongue, a lot of rolled R's, that kind of thing.
After their pick loses, I guess.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I'd been to see a lot of other Japanese sports like baseball. My team in Japan is Hanshin Tigers, and Koshien Stadium is pretty, can be pretty rough and loud and visceral, but. And I've been to see soccer and sumo and golf, and generally, people shout encouragement because they want their guy or their team to win. But this was the first time I'd heard, really quite unvarnished criticism of of the riders out there, doing their very best to win. So that was also quite a novel experience, totally different from any other kind of sporting venue that I'd been to in Japan up until then.
Yeah. I think I probably first learned of the existence of this sort of, world of, gambling and bike racing through the Kitano Takeshi movie. I think the English title is Kikujiro.
Right.
And there's a scene where he takes the kid to one of these places, and of course, I think he loses. I mean, I'm pretty sure he loses. And so when I first saw that, I go like, who are these people? Like, why are people betting on bikes? Of course, everybody knows about horse racing, but, bicycle racing, like, what is this? Like, it just totally perplexed me, so.
Yeah, it gets an appearance in that Kitano Takeshi film. There's a very old film made in the 50s about a female Keirin rider, who wants to be a professional rider despite the objections of her parents. It makes occasional appearances in popular Japanese culture, but it's certainly not mainstream. I think that would be the best way to describe it.
What I found just utterly fascinating is, you talk about the Grand Prix and you I think in the intro and towards the end of the book, you kind of outline that. You give a little narrative of the races and that day, your experience that day. And it's fascinating. And reading the book, it's a fascinating world, just seeing all the work that goes into, becoming one of these cyclists and just, it's an incredible world. And yet it seems like hidden away, tucked away into the corners of Japan. Like you barely get it on TV. You don't hear about it in the news. It's not like the Kentucky Derby or whatever, where at least, horse racing has, it seems to me at least, some sort of level of prestige in some way. But this seems like the kind of dirty underworld that people try to kind of like push away in a way.
Yeah, that's a really good way of describing it. Horse racing, it's a gambling sport, and Japan has this rather complicated relationship with gambling. But horse racing, certainly in the mainstream, I don't think anybody sort of apologizes for being into horse racing and going to racetracks and gambling on races. Keirin seems to occupy a slightly different world, and like you say, with the exception of the Grand Prix final, which gets aired on terrestrial TV. Sometimes NHK, sometimes one of the commercial channels. You could go there's a Keirin race on somewhere in Japan pretty much every day of the year. But unless you subscribe to one of the cable channels or you watch online, you can go an entire year without seeing a single reference to Keirin in the sports news roundup on TV. I remember going, I mentioned this in the book as well, going to the huge Kinokuniya in the Umeda area of Osaka a few years ago. I thought I'll go and buy a few books about Keirin, see what I can learn from those. I'd already ordered a load of manga. There was a manga series online, but I went into Kinokuniya, and of course I went straight to the sports section, and I found lots of books on rugby and golf and football, and I was thinking where and fishing, and I was thinking where's the cycling stuff? Where are the Keirin books? And I couldn't find a single title, so I asked a member of staff, I'm looking for the Keirin section, and she said, "Oh no, you're in the wrong place. Come with me." I followed her, and of course she took me to the gambling section of Kinokuniya, and that's when it really struck me that Keirin is a sport. The men and women who ride bicycles around Keirin tracks they're elite athletes. They spend a year crafting bodies that are specifically designed to ride bicycles around velodromes at very high speeds. Yet in a sense they're not really considered, or their sport isn't really considered a legitimate sport, which I found intriguing.
All right, so I do want to dig into that a little bit further, but first, could you give us an idea of what distinguishes as a sport, like kind of the dynamics of the sport? How is it different than I don't know, like because when I hear, it's bicycle racing, okay, I think everybody lines up and, they all just pedal as fast as they can and the first one wins, and that's how it is, because that's typically, what you think a race is, right? But there's a lot more going on in how the actual race works, right?
Yeah. It is very different from some of the other track cycling disciplines. So if you watch, I think it's important there are really two Keirins, if I could put it that way. There's the UCI, the Olympic version of Keirin that you'll see. Yeah, you'll see at the games, the summer games. You'll see at the World Championships, the World Cup. Some of the regional championships, and that's 6 riders riding around 250-meter, very steeply banked velodromes. There'll be no touching, no barging. They'll be led round the track by a motorized gurney. If you've ever watched Olympic Keirin, I mean, most people will probably not watch Keirin at all, and then when the Olympics come round, they catch the end of a Keirin race, and they see this guy on a motorized on a little sort of motorcycle leading these cyclists around a track, and think, that looks odd. Perhaps I'll watch a bit more of this. So that, I think that's most people's exposure to Keirin is really based around the Olympics. So you have your Olympic version, which was first introduced in Sydney in 2000, and then you have the original Japanese version, which has been around for more than 70 years. And first of all, the bikes are very different. They're old steel. They're steel frames. They look very similar. The parts all have to be approved by the Keirin authorities. They ride around outdoor velodromes, which can range from 330 meters up to 400, and there are a few that are 500 meters. So you're talking about much, much bigger velodromes. And also the rules are different. You'll see headbutting, you'll see shoulder barging and blocking. And you'll see collaboration between riders who train together, riders who are from the same region of Japan. You'll see riders angling for positions based on their age. So if you have a younger rider who trains with an older guy, you'll quite often see the younger guy riding in front of him during the first portions of the race to protect his older colleague from headwinds, and give him a fighting chance of coming from behind and winning the race. So you've got this whole sort of seniority factor within a Japanese Keirin race. So that's why the Japanese Keirin authorities, I was a little bit confused at first when I started talking to them. They would talk about kanji Keirin, so Keirin spelt using kanji characters, which describes the Japanese sport, and katakana Keirin, which is the version of Keirin that has become, a fairly popular Olympic and UCI track discipline. So you've kind of got two versions of the same sport, but the differences are so stark that you could actually be talking about two different sports sometimes. So what really sets to answering your question, what I think sets Keirin apart from other track races is this. First of all, it's paced. You've got the motorized derny in the Olympics. In Japanese Keirin, you have basically a Keirin rider who's earning a bit of pocket money by riding a bicycle around the track in his role as the pacemaker, which is unusual. Although, you could go back to the 1920s, 1930s in Northern Europe, Germany, Denmark, places like that, where they would have paced races. You'd have a cyclist behind a huge motorcycle to protect him from the headwind, get him up to a certain speed, and then the motorcyclist would peel off, and there'd be a sprint for the finish. The difference with Keirin is that you've got 9 riders all doing that behind a single pacemaker, so it's different in that respect. And then in terms of the Japanese sport, as I said, there are two elements that you should bear in mind when you're watching a typical Keirin race, and one is the presence of regional loyalties. So make no mistake, when they line up at the start of a race, these 9 riders, 9 if it's a men's race, 7 if it's a women's race, they're individual athletes and they all want to win, and they'll all do their very best to cross the finish line first. But there's also an element of collaboration between, as I said, between riders who, perhaps they're from Hokkaido, or they're from Tohoku, or they're from, the Minami Kanto area near Tokyo, or they might be from the Kinki region in Western Japan, or from Shikoku or Kyushu. So there'll be an element of collaboration. And then how that collaboration works is largely determined by seniority. So the younger guys will be the ones leading off his more senior colleagues, protecting them. In turn, at some point in the future, a new recruit will come along and return the favor. So it's let me put it this way: it's cycling with Japanese characteristics. I think that's that's probably the most succinct way to describe Keirin racing.
Yeah. No, I mean, at the same time, like it has this sort of element of organization, and in a way you could say like the whole senpai kohai, kind of hierarchy too, but it's also like really brutal. I mean, some of the accidents and incidents that you described that occur on the track, I mean, they're just, really, really like tough stuff. So
yeah, it's an extremely physical sport. And I think the clashes and the crashes are just an inevitability of having 9 cyclists in close proximity, cycling around a concrete track at speeds of up to 65, sometimes 70 kilometers an hour, and it's I have mixed feelings about the physicality of it. In one sense, it's really thrilling, and it's quite shocking sometimes when you see two guys who are neck and neck with 50 meters to the finish line, and they start headbutting each other while they're riding at high speed or shoulder barging. Yeah. But nobody wants to see them crash because, first of all, you don't want to see people getting injured. There've been, a handful of deaths on Japanese velodromes over the decades. And of course, if you're betting on a race and, you want rider number 3 to come in first, but rider number 3 falls off his bike with half a lap to go, then, of course, your bet is absolutely worthless. So from that perspective, too, nobody wants to see too many thrills and spills on the Keirin track. But yeah, I don't have any statistics for how regular rakusha, somebody coming off their bike is in Keirin cycling, but I wouldn't say it's unusual. If I think you could go to a velodrome and watch, half a day's racing, so 6 or 7 races, and it wouldn't be highly unusual if you saw one that ended with 2 or 3 riders. All it takes really at that speed is for somebody to just touch the back wheel of the rider in front, and of course mayhem can ensue. Right.
So earlier we touched briefly on becoming a cyclist, and in the book you actually go to. Is it the only school, or are there multiple schools? Because you actually have to go to a school before you can actually become one of these Keirin cyclists, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's the only school, and if you haven't been there and graduated, then you will not get your professional rider license. So it's an absolute must. Now, in the book, it's referred to as the Japan Keirin School, which is what it was known as for many years. It's now, as I was sort of reaching the end of the I guess it would have been one of the later manuscripts anyway.
Sure.
The Japan Keirin Association kind of threw a spanner in the works and decided to rename it the Japan Institute of Keirin, which was sort of an attempt to kind of modernize its image with the Tokyo Olympics on the horizon. But I do note that there's been a name change towards the end of the book. But and that's. So let's refer to it as the Japan Keirin School. You have to have graduated from high school, so you've got to be at least 18 to attempt to get into the school. There'll be some sort of physical examinations, some physical challenges, including obviously riding a bike, but they don't assume that people are expert cyclists when they apply to join the Keirin School. They just have to have some of the physical attributes and the determination to learn and to succeed. And they'll spend 11 months at the Keirin School, which is near Mount Fuji. It's it's sort of in the Izu area of Shizuoka Prefecture, and it's a let's describe it as a difficult and challenging 11 months. They lead fairly Spartan lifestyles. There is obviously daily sessions on rollers, lifting weights, competing on outdoor velodrome, sometimes at the Olympic velodrome in Izu, which is indoors. Very strict rules about personal conduct. There are obviously a mixture of men. I mean, men make up the vast majority of the trainees, but there's also a smaller number of women, and has been since women's Keirin was reintroduced in 2012. They're kept pretty much apart during the entire 11 months that they're at the school. They eat separately. They eat in the same cafeteria, but at separate tables. The women's bedrooms occupy a floor of their own in the dormitory, so there are no men's and women's rooms on the same floor. And it's odd because these some of them are 18-year-olds who've just graduated from high school, so in the Japanese strict Japanese legal sense, they're still kids. At least they're still minors, but you know, a lot of them are much older and have had careers in sports like speed skating. You know, there's been a few volleyball players over the years, alpine skiers, you know, basically people with big legs. And they're adults. In fact, one of the people I interview in the book, Miyoko Takamatsu, she was one of the first women to become a professional Keirin rider when the women's sport was revived back in 2012. And, you know, she was an accomplished road racer, make no mistake. She was a very good cyclist. And she was a school teacher. But when she entered the Keirin school, she was already 49 years old. So, and now I remember during the course of the few days I spent at the Keirin school researching the book, the student, I think the oldest student was, again, it was a woman, and I think she was in her late 30s, and then there were lots of people in their 20s and a few teenagers. So they're treated like children, but in fact, most of them are adults with either sporting or other careers, you know, already under their belt. So it's a strange world. But what's happened, and I think the Olympics has been the catalyst for this, is they're trying to modernize. I think that's partly the influence of the two main coaches for the Japanese track cycling team, which is based nearby, who also work as coaches at the Keirin school. That's Jason Niblett, an Australian, and the head coach, Benoit Vetu, who's a French former track cyclist. And I think that you can see their influence. So what's happened in the last year or two is, they're using more modern methods for training. But there've been other little tweaks to the rules, which I think have made life a little bit easier for the trainees. So the women no longer have to have their hair a certain length. You know, they can grow their hair longer as long as they tie it back, and it obviously doesn't interfere with their cycling when they're wearing their helmets. The men no longer all have to have skinheads. They can, you know, looking at the rows and rows of male trainees who were graduating when I was there a couple of years ago, it looked like a gathering of high school baseball players, because they all had that identical shaved heads. That's no longer, you know, if they want to grow their hair out a little bit, that's acceptable. And you know, until very recently, there was basically a ban on the use of mobile phones. If they wanted to call home and talk to their mums and dads or somebody else, they had to use payphones. And I think it was like on a Sunday evening, there was a brief window where they could take turns to use payphones to call home. But now they're allowed a little bit of time on their smartphones, although not very much. So it's a really tough introduction to the world of professional Keirin cycling. But when they come out of it at the end, if they do everything that's been asked of them, you know, in most cases, people graduate, they get their professional license, and then 2 or 3 months later, usually in the summer, so they graduate in the spring. By midsummer, early to midsummer, they'll most of them have made their professional debuts, and they're ready for it, you know, because they have been trained to the nth degree in how to ride a Keirin bicycle at high speed. They know the rules inside out, but they also know that as Keirin cyclists, they're ambassadors for their sport. They're aware that not everybody in Japan is comfortable with the idea of betting on sport. So I remember, you know, sitting in some of the lectures at the Keirin school. It's drummed into them from day one that people are betting their hard-earned money on them, and they have, in return, they have to do their best right up until the very end. You know, there's no giving up. There's, you know, if they're injured, okay, fair enough, but they really do have to repay the faith that's been put in them by the Japanese public. You know, many of whom will gamble large sums on them, and there's also a stress on, you know, avoiding any. Obviously, occasionally you'll find athletes and famous sportsmen and women involved in some sort of scandal. But with Keirin races, I don't really remember the last time I read about a professional cyclist in Japan who'd been caught up in some sort of scandal, because they know that if there was even a whiff of, say, match race fixing or something like that, or association with organized crime, then that would not only be a problem for the individual rider, but it would be a problem for the sport as a whole, because the sport is constantly fighting to protect its reputation because it's one of the very few sports in Japan on which it's legal to gamble money.
Yeah. Again, I mean, we touched on this earlier, but it's so interesting in that, like, this is, these people are athletes. They are training, hard as hell, and putting themselves in these dangerous situations on these tracks, going at high speeds, and yet, they're in this like weird kind of limbo where, like, for example, all these different kind of measures to make sure that, no funny business is going on in relation to gambling, right? Like, they get isolated during tracks. They can't contact people. If you're a journalist and you go to interview them during one of these events, you can't take your phone. Like, things like crazy things like this that you don't see in like other sports, right? So they have this kind of physical demand, but there's this whole other aspect to it, and yet these people are, for the most part, anonymous to like even the average Japanese person, right?
Yeah, that's right. You mentioned the requirements for race meets, and they're very strict. The riders will arrive. Say there's a 3-day competition somewhere. They'll arrive the day before, check in their mobile phone, not just their mobile phone, but if they've got any kind of gadget with the online, with the online functionality, then they have to hand that in, and then they spend the duration of the meet, offline. And this is obviously to remove any potential whatsoever for contact with the outside world, to discuss tactics with somebody who's maybe planning to place money on a particular race. And obviously to rule out any potential for match fixing, because I think any evidence of match fixing in Keirin would probably be the beginning of the end for the sport. So they do live under very strict conditions during meets, and of course, I mean they're all their own managers. So they decide really how many races they want to ride in over the course of the year, of course, and they need to compete often enough to make a decent living. So, a lot of them will compete fairly regularly, which means they could spend a sizable chunk of the year, practically cut off from the rest of society, living these very analog lives in what I guess amounts to a form of lockdown. But they wouldn't be able to. Keirin wouldn't be able to survive if it weren't for these very strict measures that are put in place during meetings. And yes, I visited a lot of velodromes and went into the riders area. And at the entrance, you're met by somebody from the velodrome management or from the Japan Keirin Association, and the first thing they do is ensure that your smartphone is switched off. They're absolutely insistent on that, and entirely understandably.
Sure, yeah.
The integrity of the sport is at stake. So I totally understand why that's the case. It can be a problem if you plan to take photos on your smartphone and forget to take a regular camera, which did happen once, but then you learn to remember, okay, no smartphones, I'm just going to have to do it the conventional way.
Yeah, no, I could keep asking you more about this, but I do want to touch on a couple other topics before we finish up. But one thing you describe in the book is actually getting to ride on a track and on one of these bikes. Could you talk a little bit about that? That seems like it was quite a fun but scary experience.
Yeah, I hadn't intended to do that when I started writing the book, or at least started doing the research. But I got to know actually somebody I knew already, Seiichi, who's mentioned in the book a few times, and he owns a vintage bicycle shop in Tokyo called Corsa Corsa. He's pretty well known. He loves Keirin. One of his regulars is a retired Keirin racer. He hasn't raced for, I guess, it must be almost a quarter of a century now. But anyway, during the course of an afternoon at Seiichi's shop, Ito-san came over. We had coffee, and I just sort of put it out there and said to Seiichi, well, how about going to Izu Velodrome, which is the venue for the Olympic track cycling this summer, if the Olympics happen, of course. Have to put that out there as well.
Sure.
And Ito-san said, well, I've got a frame that I used when I was a professional. It's kind of gathering dust in my garage. You'd be welcome to use that. You'll need to put new tires and a new chain on it, but basically it's ready to go. So that's what we did. Seiichi put a new chain and new tires on it, cleaned it up a bit, measured me up so that the saddle and the handlebars were all in the right position. And a few days later, we got in the car and drove down to Izu, and it was odd. I was determined to do it because you remember there was a fixie craze in the US and here in Japan as well a few years ago. I was never really part of that, so I hadn't ridden a fixed gear bicycle. I'd ridden mountain bikes, cross bikes, road bikes, but never a Keirin bike with a steel frame and no brakes. This is
no brakes. Yeah, I was going to point that out.
Yeah, there are no brakes.
Yeah.
So we went to Izu Velodrome, and fortunately there was nobody else using the track. In fact, we watched some of the Japanese Paralympic track cycling team go through the motions. They were being put through their paces on the track before we got on the track, and that was incredible to watch, and just made me realize how completely unprepared I thought I was for this. But after a few laps, I started sort of with each lap that passed, I would sort of edge to the right a little bit and go further up the bank, because it's only a 250-meter track, so it's very steeply banked. I can't remember the exact gradient, but it's quite frightening when you stand at the bottom and look up and sort of take in that really steep angle and think, oh, hang on a minute, I have to ride a bicycle around this. But I would sort of edge up the track with each lap, and it's sort of counterintuitive, because you think your natural instinct is to think that when you're riding up the side of a track at a fairly steep angle, that you want to slow down and kind of lean into it. But in fact, what you need to do is to speed up, so that you build the momentum that sort of that takes you round and prevents your wheels. The worst thing that can happen is for your wheels to slip, because you're compensating for the angle and you're going too slowly, and that's when you have accidents. So I took it. I thought I was doing really well and going super fast, and Seiichi had taken some video clips, and I watched the video later on, and I was going at absolute snail's pace. But I didn't fall off.
Okay.
I think if anyone ever gets the opportunity to try it out, then I would highly recommend it. But the one thing that I think perhaps kept me on my bicycle rather than on the velodrome floor was that I just kept reminding myself, keep pedaling, because of course, if the back wheel of a Keirin bike is turning, then so are the pedals. There's no freewheeling. So you've just got to keep pedaling. And of course, you slowed because there are no brakes. The only way you can slow down is to start just gently exerting kind of reverse pressure on the pedals. So I discovered, a day or two later, I discovered that I had muscles that I'd never imagined existed because I was using them pretty much for the first time in putting the reverse pressure on the pedals. So it was a great experience. I do have my own Keirin bike now. I bought a secondhand frame made by one of the bike builders that I interviewed for the book. went to Seiichi's shop again. Seiichi's not paying me commission to advertise his vintage bicycle shop, I promise you. But he and we sourced the proper saddle and chain, pedals, handlebars, all the rest of it. But I did ask him to put some brakes on it because it would be illegal for me to ride it around the streets of Tokyo without.
That's what I was going to ask you. Yeah.
without brakes. So it does have brakes. But to all intents and purposes, it looks like a Keirin bike with brakes, cool. And it's great. It's great fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Okay, so then one last area here that I want to ask you about. So, of course, everybody knows, I think, this. Anybody that knows anything about Japan is aware of the aging population. And then you mentioned, of course, that there are, of course, older, relatively speaking, right? It's not just people in their teens and 20s that are competing here. There's people in their 40s and even 50s. And you talk quite a bit about this in the book. And then also, just the people that are going to watch these events. It certainly seems like Keirin is not in its prime at the moment. They're trying different things to bring in more people, including, really pushing the kind of female aspect of it as well. But what do you think? Like, where do you think we go from here? What like in 20 years or something? Like, do you think Keirin is going to be around? Is it going to grow? Is it going to kind of slowly shrink as everything else? What can you tell us?
Yeah. That's a great question, and one that I spent quite a lot of time at least attempting to answer in the book. I don't know if I came up with a definitive answer to that question, but I think Keirin's at a crossroads. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. So it's survived and at times really prospered over the last 73 years. Since that very first Keirin race in Kokura back in November 1948. It's been really, I think that the history of Keirin is in many respects the history of Japan, of post-war Japan. So it had its heyday in the 60s and 70s and 80s when, the Japanese economy was undergoing these, phenomenal transformations. People were betting ridiculous amounts of money on Keirin. And then, the bubble burst at the start of the 90s and Keirin, just like every other facet of Japanese life was affected by that. So now we have, 20 years on, we have warnings of demographic meltdown in Japan because of the aging and shrinking population. And that's also going to be a challenge for Keirin cycling. So you mentioned attempts to broaden the sport's appeal by, for example, women competed in Keirin right from day one. There was a women's race in Kokura back in 1948, and women's Keirin was very popular for a while until at some point in the 60s, the sport was dominated by a handful of riders. So it wasn't a particularly attractive prospect for people wanting to gamble, because if you're pretty sure of who's going to win, there are never going to be any significant payouts. And this was a problem because, Keirin was set up in the first place to raise tax revenue through gambling to put back into Japanese infrastructure projects after the war. But in 2012, which is incidentally when women's Keirin made its debut in the Olympics in London, at London 2012, Japanese women's Keirin was reborn, rather unfortunately as girls' Keirin. I do sort of talk about it a little bit in the book, but I still have a problem. I know that there was pressure on the Keirin authorities not to refer to Joshi Keirin, which was the post-war version, because Joshi Keirin disappeared, so they had to find a new name. And unfortunately, they came up with Girls Keirin, to refer to women who are, professional athletes. But anyway, we won't dwell on that.
No, there's so much to the female aspect of this story that we just can't touch on today. But in the book, there's so much more. It's really interesting. So anybody that's interested in that, definitely check out the book. But yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah.
and that succeeded. In a limited way, I think it certainly brought more women to velodromes. There was a time when there weren't women's bathrooms at velodromes.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, we're going back a few years now, but it just seems remarkable that was once the case. So, yeah, a lot of the velodromes which were built sort of in the post-war era in suburban. In the suburbs of major Japanese cities, they were spruced up, made more female friendly, and a lot of younger guys suddenly got into Keirin because women were now involved as well as the men. And then a few years ago, the Keirin authorities introduced what they call midnight Keirin, which, despite its name, is actually a Keirin meet that begins sort of late evening and ends around 11:30 p.m. So in fact, before midnight. But anyway, right. Midnight Keirin is quite a snappy name to describe it. And the key thing about midnight Keirin is that there are no spectators. It's just the cyclists, and the idea was to encourage people to bet online. I should add, I'm not encouraging anyone to gamble on Keirin or any other sport. I happen to do it myself occasionally. I bet so little that even when I win, we're talking about a few hundred yen. Enough for a beer and some yakitori on the way home from the velodrome, but nothing more than that. But Keirin does it's designed to generate tax revenue. So. Given that a lot of people, younger people in particular, spend so much time online, they thought that it would be a good idea to have these midnight races where people could only bet online and not at the velodromes themselves. And that's helped bring the Keirin sales up over the last few years. So I wouldn't say, I certainly wouldn't go as far as to say that Keirin is facing an existential crisis. But, if it's survived for 73 years, if it wants to survive and prosper over the next 7 decades, there definitely need to be some changes made to the way the sport is presented to the outside world. So it's all very well kind of encouraging online gambling and maybe getting a few more women through the velodrome turnstiles to watch races. But I think its future really lies in its international appeal. And I'm not sure that the Keirin authorities are serious about recognizing the potential for Keirin as an international sport. I mentioned South Korean Keirin. South Korea is the only other country in the world where there's a professional Keirin league. And until recently, every other year, some of the best South Korean and some of the best Japanese male riders would get together either in South Korea or in Japan and compete against each other. It was the Nikkan Keirin series, and that was a really bold experiment in international Keirin, but that has fallen by the wayside. There are well documented diplomatic and political and historical issues between Japan and South Korea, and it looks like the Nikkan Keirin series has become a victim of that. Obviously, the pandemic has complicated things further. They do invite a small number of foreign men and women to compete in Japan. I think they give them a license that lasts about 4 months, and they can spread that over the course of about 2 years. So maybe they'll spend a couple of months in Japan one summer and then a couple of months the following summer. And one of the athletes in the book, Joe Truman, who's a member of the Great Britain track cycling team, was spent a couple of summers competing in Japan and did very well. And it's that sort of international angle that I think really needs to be pushed more than it has been up until now, because the way that Japanese demographics are going, I don't think it can survive as a solely domestic sport.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, there is so much more in the book, and I absolutely love it when I come across a book like this that is, fun to read, but also teaches me like so much about this kind of aspect of Japan that I think, especially outside of Japan, but even within Japan, like people just don't know about, but there is so much to it. So I really enjoyed reading the book and learning all about this kind of Keirin thing, which I was aware of, but I had never really bothered to dig into. So thank you. It was a wonderful read.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really kind. And you're right. Yeah, I've met so many Japanese people, and I tell them that I'm writing a book about Keirin.
Yeah, they go, why?
I say that I get blank stares, and including from my own family. But I have to say, 3 or so years after I began researching the book, that my wife and my two children know far more about Keirin than they could have ever bargained for. So I know at least 3 people I know in Japan have become converts. Perhaps unwillingly. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much. Of course, I'll put the link in the show notes, but thanks for making time. I had a wonderful time talking to you.
Yeah, me too. It was great. Thanks very much.
Again, the book is called The War on Wheels, or The War on Wheels. I think either way, you'll be able to find it. Link in the show notes. Of course, don't forget the Amazon affiliate link, japankyo.com/Amazon. If you want to support the show, won't cost you anything extra. And if you don't want to support the show, well, then I guess I'm not trying hard enough, huh? Of course, anything you buy with that Amazon affiliate link, then it won't cost you anything extra. So, hey, we all win, right? Anyway, if you have any questions or comments, send them over to mail@japanstationpodcast.com. Don't forget to subscribe. That is the number one free thing you can do to support the show. Rate and review, and tell a friend about the show. Maybe post an episode on Reddit or Facebook or Twitter. That stuff all helps immensely. And of course, don't forget to follow on Facebook and Twitter @JapanKyo News. And thank you to Unomi for providing the opening and closing song, Oedo Controller, link in the show notes. That does it for this episode. The next episode should be out on July 1st, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't subscribed yet, then make sure to do that so you don't miss that episode when it comes out. And don't forget to check out the latest episode of Ichimon Japan. That's episode 45. In that one, we're talking about furyō and yankī, which are basically Japan's juvenile delinquents. And we're talking about pompadours and shaved eyebrows and dyed hair and 2 blocks and a whole bunch of other stuff. So if that sounds interesting to you, go to japankyo.com/Ichimon Japan or look up Ichimon Japan wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. And remember, go find your miniature pony.
Just do it!